The settlement of Cedar Rapids appeared like a mirage through the morning mist, its collection of wooden buildings and smoking chimneys the most beautiful sight Emma had ever seen. After 2 weeks of wilderness travel, the simple presence of other human beings felt like a miracle. "There it is," Jake said quietly, stopping Belle on a ridge overlooking the town. "We made it." Emma felt tears spring to her eyes. They had actually done it. 2 orphaned children and a drifting cowboy had crossed 200 miles of winter wilderness and survived everything the trail could throw at them. Tommy whooped with joy and nearly fell off Belle in his excitement. "Look, there are people." Down in the settlement, Emma could see smoke rising from chimneys, people walking between buildings, and the warm glow of windows lit against the morning shadows. It looked like paradise. But as they rode down toward the town, Emma found herself feeling strangely reluctant to reach their destination. For the past 2 weeks, it had been just the 3 of them against the world. Soon, that would change forever. "What happens now?" she asked Jake as they approached the first buildings. Jake was quiet for a moment. "Now we find someone who can take proper care of you, and Tommy," he said. "Someone who can give you a home and a future." Emma's heart sank, though she had known this moment would come. "What about you?" "I'll move on," Jake said. "Like I always do." Emma found herself sitting in the inn's main room, clean and warm and well-fed for the first time in weeks, while various townspeople discussed her and Tommy's future as if they weren't there. "The Hendersons lost their boy to fever last winter," one woman was saying. "They've been talking about taking in orphans." "What about the Millers?" suggested another. "They've got the biggest farm, and they could use the help." Emma listened to the conversations with growing anxiety. These people meant well, but they were talking about splitting her and Tommy up, sending them to different families where they would be useful workers. "Excuse me," Emma said loudly, interrupting the discussion. "Tommy and I stay together. We don't get separated." The adults looked at her with a mixture of surprise and irritation. Children weren't supposed to make demands about their own placement. "Now, dear," said one of the women, "you need to be practical. Not every family can take 2 children, especially when one's so young." "Then, we'll wait until you find a family that can," Emma said firmly. Jake, who had been quiet during most of these discussions, suddenly stood up. "She's right," he said. "Those children have been through enough. They don't get split up." An older man named Samuel Wright, who seemed to carry some authority in the town, frowned at Jake. "With respect, stranger, this isn't your decision to make. These children need to be placed where they can be properly cared for." "I've been caring for them just fine for 2 weeks," Jake replied, his voice carrying a hint of steel. Emma saw something in Jake's expression that she hadn't seen before, a kind of protective anger that reminded her of how her own father had looked when someone threatened his family. "Jake," she said quietly, "it's okay. We'll manage whatever happens." But Jake was already shaking his head. "No," he said. "It's not okay." He turned to address the room full of townspeople. "These aren't just random orphans looking for charity. Emma saved my life during our journey. She built the fire that kept us all from freezing to death. She's been taking care of her little brother since their parents died, and she's done a better job than most adults could." Emma felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but also with pride. Jake continued speaking, his voice growing stronger. "Tommy may be young, but he's tough as leather. He walked 200 miles through winter without complaining once. He's pulled his weight every day, even when he was scared and hungry and cold." The room had gone quiet, and Emma could see that Jake's words were having an impact. "You want to split them up and send them to work for families who see them as free labor," Jake continued. "But they're not workers. They're children who deserve to stay together and have a real home." Samuel Wright crossed his arms. "That's a nice speech, mister, but it doesn't solve the practical problem. Who's going to take both children?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Emma's complete shock, he said, "I will." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Emma felt her heart stop, then begin racing. "You?" Wright said skeptically. "A drifter with no permanent address and no visible means of support." "I have skills," Jake said calmly. "I can work. And I know these children better than anyone else in this room." Emma found her voice. "Jake, you don't have to do this for us." Jake looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Maybe I'm not doing it just for you, he said quietly. Maybe I'm tired of being alone. Maybe I'm ready to stop running from the past and start building something new. The debate continued for another hour, with various townspeople expressing doubts about Jake's suitability as a guardian. But Emma could see that opinions were shifting, especially among the women, who seemed moved by Jake's obvious devotion to the children's welfare. Finally, Samuel Wright made a proposal. Tell you what, Morrison, you can stay here for the winter. There's work available, and you can prove you're serious about this responsibility. Come spring, if you've shown you can provide a stable home for these children, we'll help you make it official. Jake considered the offer. What kind of work? The sawmill needs a foreman. The previous one moved on last month. It pays decent wages, and there's a house that goes with the job. Emma held her breath, waiting for Jake's answer. This was the moment when their makeshift family would either become permanent or fall apart forever. I'll take it, Jake said finally. On one condition. What's that? Emma and Tommy have a say in this decision. If they'd rather be placed with another family, I won't stand in their way. All eyes turned to Emma. She looked at Tommy, who was staring at her with hope and anxiety written all over his young face. Tommy, she said quietly, what do you want? Tommy didn't hesitate. I want to stay with Jake. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. She looked at Jake, this man who had saved their lives and become the closest thing to a father either of them had since their parents died. We want to stay together, she said. All three of us. Jake's stern expression softened into something that might have been relief, or joy, or both. Then, it settled. 3 months later, Emma stood in the kitchen of their small house behind the sawmill, helping Jake prepare dinner. Tommy was at the table doing arithmetic problems that the local schoolteacher had assigned him, his tongue sticking out in concentration. It had been a hard winter in some ways. Jake worked long hours at the sawmill, and Emma had taken on most of the housekeeping responsibilities. Tommy had struggled at first with the structure of regular school attendance after months of wilderness freedom, but they had made it work. Jake had proven to be a patient and caring guardian, helping with homework, teaching them both to read better, and making sure they had everything they needed. Most importantly, he had kept his promise that they would never be separated. Emma, Jake said as they worked side by side preparing vegetables, I want to ask you something. What? How would you feel about making this permanent? About me adopting you and Tommy legally? Emma felt her heart skip. Is that what you want? Jake nodded. I've been thinking about it for weeks. You two aren't just children I'm taking care of anymore. You're my family. The family I thought I'd lost forever. Emma looked around their small, warm kitchen, at Tommy bent over his schoolwork, at Jake with his sleeves rolled up, and flour in his hair from helping her bake bread. This wasn't the life she had planned when they left Missouri with their parents. It wasn't the farm in Oregon or the future her father had dreamed of. But it was something else, something she hadn't expected but had come to treasure. It was home. Yes, she said quietly. I'd like that very much. Jake smiled, the kind of genuine smile she had learned to recognize as his happiest expression. Then, we'll talk to the judge next week. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, Emma sat with Jake by their fireplace and thought about how much their lives had changed since that first night when he had shared his fire and food with 2 desperate orphans. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Taking us on. Jake looked at her with surprise. Regret it? Emma, you and Tommy saved my life as much as I saved yours. How? Before I found you, I was just drifting through life without purpose or direction. I had given up on the idea that I could have a family again, or a home, or anything worth fighting for. He poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks up the chimney. You gave me a reason to stop running from the past and start building a future. Emma nodded, understanding. They had all saved each other in different ways. Outside, snow was falling again, but inside their small house it was warm and bright and safe. They had traveled through wilderness and danger to find each other, and they had proven that family wasn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it was about the people who chose to stand by you when the world seemed determined to tear you apart. Sometimes it was about sharing your fire with strangers who needed warmth. And sometimes it was about discovering that the greatest rescues are the ones where everybody saves everybody else. Emma looked at Jake, this man who had become her father in every way that mattered, and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But whatever came next, they would face it the same way they had faced the wilderness trail. Together, the morning of the river crossing dawned clear but bitterly cold. Ice had formed along the banks overnight, and their breath steamed in the air as they prepared for what Jake called the most dangerous thing we'll do on this whole trip. Their makeshift raft bobbed in the shallow water near the shore, looking far less sturdy than it had seemed the night before. Jake had spent the early morning hours reinforcing the lashings and testing every joint, but Emma could see the worry in his eyes. "Remember the plan," Jake said as they prepared to launch. "Emma, you and Tommy stay in the center of the raft. Don't move around, don't lean over the sides, and if we hit trouble, grab onto me and don't let go." He had loaded Belle with their most essential supplies and planned to swim her across separately after getting the children safely to the other side. It was dangerous to split up, but the raft couldn't support the weight of the horse. "What if the raft comes apart?" Tommy asked, his voice small and frightened. "It won't," Jake said with more confidence than he probably felt. "We built it strong, and we're going straight across to that point there." He indicated a spot on the far shore where the bank looked accessible. "The current will carry us downstream some, but we'll make it." Emma helped Tommy onto the raft, which immediately felt unsteady under their weight. Jake pushed them off from shore and jumped aboard, using a long pole to guide them into the current. The river was even more powerful than it had looked from shore. Within seconds, they were moving faster than Emma had expected, and she could feel the raft flexing and creaking under the pressure of the water. "Hold on," Jake warned, working the pole to keep them pointed toward their target on the far shore. Everything went wrong at once. A hidden rock caught one corner of the raft, spinning them sideways in the current. The sudden rotation loosened some of the lashings, and Emma heard the sickening sound of wood beginning to separate. "The raft's coming apart," she shouted over the roar of the water. Jake fought to control their direction, but they were moving too fast, and the raft was becoming unstable. Water began washing over the logs as they sat lower in the river. "When I tell you to jump, you grab Tommy and swim for shore," Jake yelled. "Don't wait for me." Emma looked at the black, churning water and felt terror freeze her blood. She was a decent swimmer in calm water, but this was different. This was water that could kill. Before Jake could give the order to abandon the raft, another piece of their makeshift vessel broke away completely. Now they were riding on just half a raft, spinning helplessly in the current while the shore seemed to race past them. "Now," Jake shouted. "Jump now." Emma grabbed Tommy around the waist and leaped into the icy water, gasping with shock as the cold hit her like a physical blow. The current immediately seized them, pulling them under and spinning them around. Emma kicked desperately for the surface, holding tight to Tommy despite the river's attempts to tear him from her grasp. When they broke through, Tommy was coughing and sputtering but alive. "Swim," Emma gasped, striking out for the shore with Tommy clutched against her side. "Kick your feet." The water was so cold it made her muscles cramp, and her heavy winter clothes felt like they weighed 100 pounds. But Emma had grown up swimming in farm ponds, and desperation gave her strength she didn't know she had. Behind them, she could hear Jake in the water, fighting his own battle with the current. She didn't dare look back to see how he was doing. The shore seemed impossibly far away, but gradually Emma realized they were making progress. The current was carrying them downstream, but it was also pushing them toward the bank. Emma's feet touched bottom just as her strength gave out completely. She half crawled, half swam through the shallows, dragging Tommy with her until they collapsed on the rocky shore. They were alive, but they were soaked and freezing, and hypothermia was now their biggest enemy. "Tommy," Emma gasped, "are you hurt?" Her brother was shaking so violently he could barely speak, but he wasn't injured. "CC cold," he managed to chatter. Emma looked around desperately for Jake and saw him pulling himself onto the shore about 50 yards downstream. He was moving, which meant he was alive, but she could see that he was in trouble. "Can you walk?" she asked Tommy. Tommy nodded, though his legs were shaking. Together, they stumbled along the shore toward Jake, who was trying to stand but kept falling back down. When they reached him, Emma saw that Jake was in the early stages of hypothermia. His lips were blue, His movements were uncoordinated, and he was shivering uncontrollably. Fire, he managed to say. Need fire. Emma looked around at their situation and felt despair wash over her. They were on the wrong side of the river from Belle and most of their supplies. Their matches were soaked. Jake was rapidly becoming helpless from the cold, and she and Tommy weren't much better off. But Emma had learned things during their week together. She remembered Jake showing her how to find dry wood even in wet conditions, and how to start a fire with flint and steel when matches weren't available. Tommy, she said, help me get Jake away from the water. Together, they managed to drag Jake inland to a spot that offered some protection from the wind. Then, Emma began the most important work of her young life, gathering material for a fire that could save all their lives. She found a dead tree with dry wood at its core and broke off enough small branches to get started. She remembered Jake's lessons about tinder and searched until she found some dry grass and pine needles in a protected spot under a large rock. Jake's flint and steel were in a waterproof pouch on his belt, one of the few things that had stayed dry. Emma had never started a fire this way before, but she had watched Jake do it several times. It took her 20 tries, but eventually she got a spark that caught in the tinder. She blew gently on it, feeding it larger and larger pieces of dry material until she had a real flame. Within an hour, she had a good fire burning, and Jake was beginning to recover. Color was returning to his face, and his shivering was becoming less violent. Good work, he said when he could speak clearly again. You saved our lives. But their troubles were far from over. Belle and most of their supplies were on the other side of the river, and they had no way to get back across. What do we do now? Emma asked. Jake studied the river, which was still running fast and dangerous. Belle's smart, he said finally. She'll find her way downstream to a place where she can cross safely. Horses are better at that than people. What if she doesn't? Jake's expression was grim. Then, we walked to the settlement with what we have on us. That night, they slept cold and hungry beside their fire, taking turns keeping watch and feeding wood to the flames. Emma had never been so exhausted in her life, but she also felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of accomplishment. When crisis had struck, she hadn't panicked or given up. She had remembered her training and done what needed to be done to keep them all alive. The next morning, they heard a familiar whinny from downstream. Belle had found them. The horse had crossed the river at a natural ford about 2 miles below their position and had followed the sound of voices and smoke to their camp. She carried all their essential supplies, though some food had been lost when the packs got soaked. Smart girl, Jake said, scratching Belle's neck. I knew you'd figure it out. They spent that day drying their gear and taking inventory of their situation. They had lost about a quarter of their food, but they still had enough to reach the settlement if they were careful. More importantly, they had proven to themselves and each other that they could handle a serious crisis. The river crossing had been a disaster, but they had survived it through quick thinking and mutual support. How much farther? Emma asked as they prepared to resume their journey. About 10 days, Jake said. Maybe less if we can make good time. They had been traveling together for a week now, and the dynamics between them had changed completely. Emma no longer felt like a helpless child being rescued by a stranger. She felt like a partner in their shared survival. Jake seemed to recognize this change. He included her in more decisions, asked for her opinion on routes and campsites, and trusted her with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible when they first met. Tommy, too, had grown stronger and more capable. He could now walk for hours without complaint, help set up camp, and contribute to the work of gathering firewood and water. They were no longer 3 separate people thrown together by chance. They had become a family, forged by shared hardship and mutual dependence. As they walked through the wilderness that morning, Emma found herself thinking about what would happen when they reached the settlement. Jake had never said what his plans were beyond getting them to safety. Would he leave them there and continue his solitary wandering? Would he help them find a family to take them in? Emma realized she didn't want to think about separating from the man who had saved their lives and taught them how to save themselves. But those were questions for later. For now, they had miles to cover and challenges to face. And Emma was confident that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, warming their faces and lifting their spirits. In the distance, a hawk circled high overhead, riding the wind with effortless grace. They had survived their greatest test. Whatever came next, Emma knew they were ready for it. The third day of travel brought new challenges that tested everyone's endurance. The snow was knee-deep on Emma and thigh-deep on Tommy, making each step a struggle. Jake had taken to carrying Tommy on his shoulders for part of the day, but even his strength had limits. They had covered maybe 8 miles in 2 days, far less than Jake had hoped. At this pace, they would run out of food long before reaching the settlement. "We need to find game soon," Jake said during their midday break. "The jerky won't last another week." Emma looked around at the white wilderness surrounding them. She couldn't see any signs of animals, but Jake had already shown her that she didn't know how to read the landscape properly. "What kind of animals are out there?" she asked. "Deer, elk if we're lucky. Rabbits for sure, maybe grouse." Jake pointed to some tracks in the snow. "See those? Rabbit tracks. Fresh this morning." Emma studied the small depressions in the snow, trying to memorize the pattern. "How can you tell they're fresh?" "No snow in the tracks means they were made after the storm stopped. Wind hasn't filled them in yet." Jake stood and shouldered his pack. "We'll set snares tonight." That evening, they found shelter in a grove of pine trees that provided some protection from the wind. Jake showed Emma how to dig down through the snow to find dry wood and pine needles for kindling. "Fire's the most important thing," he explained as they worked. "Food, water, shelter, you can survive a few days without any of those. But in weather like this, you can die from cold in a few hours." As darkness fell, Jake took Emma with him to set rabbit snares along a game trail he had identified. Tommy stayed by the fire, too young to be much help with the delicate work of placing traps. "You loop the wire like this," Jake demonstrated, "right at the height where a rabbit's head would be. Too high, and they'll go under it. Too low, and they'll jump over." Emma watched carefully, trying to memorize every detail. "What if we don't catch anything?" "Then we get hungrier," Jake said simply. "But we'll catch something. Game trails like this one usually produce." They set 6 snares along different parts of the trail, then returned to their camp. Jake had managed to shoot a grouse earlier in the day with his rifle, so they had meat for dinner. It wasn't much, but it was fresh and filling. As they ate, Emma found herself studying Jake more closely. Over the past 3 days, she had learned some things about him through observation. He was left-handed but wore his gun on his right hip, which seemed strange. He had old scars on his hands that looked like they came from hard work, and sometimes she caught him favoring his left leg, as if it pained him. Most telling, he had nightmares. She had heard him muttering in his sleep the past 2 nights, words she couldn't understand but that sounded troubled and urgent. "Jake," she said carefully, "were you a soldier in the war?" Jake's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly and looked at her for a long moment. "What makes you ask that? You know things about tracks and weather and how to move through country without being seen. And sometimes at night. Sometimes at night, I have bad dreams." Jake finished for her. "Yes, I was a soldier. For years with the Army of the Potomac." Emma waited, sensing there was more he might tell her if she didn't push. "Lost my wife and little girl while I was gone," he said quietly. "Cholera took them both in the summer of '63. Came home to an empty house and graves I'd never seen." Emma felt her heart clench with sympathy. "I'm sorry." Jake nodded. "Been drifting ever since. Couldn't stay in that house with all the memories. Couldn't settle anywhere else either." "Is that why you helped us?" Emma asked. "Because of your little girl?" Jake was quiet for so long that Emma thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of being alone with nothing but ghosts for company." The next morning, they checked the snares and found 2 fat rabbits. Jake showed Emma how to skin and clean them properly, and how to stretch the hides for drying. "Rabbit fur makes good mittens and hat linings," he explained. "Out here, you don't waste anything." They made better time that day, covering nearly 10 miles through terrain that was gradually becoming more wooded. The trees provided more shelter and windbreaks, but they also made it harder to see potential threats. "Keep your eyes open," Jake warned as they walked. "These woods could hide anything." "What kind of anything?" Tommy asked nervously. Bears mostly. Wolves too. But they're usually more afraid of us than we are of them. Jake shifted his rifle to a more accessible position. Bears can be unpredictable, especially if they're still looking for food before hibernation. That afternoon, they found evidence that bears were indeed in the area. A tree showed fresh claw marks, and they discovered the remains of a log that had been torn apart, probably in search of insects. We'll need to hang our food tonight, Jake decided, and keep the fire burning bright. As evening approached, they found a good campsite beside a small creek. Jake made Emma and Tommy help gather enough firewood to last through the night, then showed them how to hang their food from a tree branch high enough and far enough from the trunk that no bear could reach it. Bears are smart, he explained. They can climb, they can reach, and they never forget a place where they found food. We don't want this to become a place they remember. That night, as they sat around their fire eating rabbit stew, Emma heard something that made her blood run cold. A long, low growl from somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp. Jake heard it too. He stood slowly and picked up his rifle, scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. What was that? Tommy whispered. Bear, Jake said quietly. Maybe more than one. Emma pulled Tommy closer to the fire, her heart racing. She had never seen a bear up close, but she had heard stories from other travelers. Bears could kill a grown man with one swipe of their claws. The growling came again, closer this time. Jake cocked his rifle and aimed toward the sound. Should we run? Emma whispered. No, Jake said firmly. Running triggers their chase instinct. We stay by the fire and make ourselves look big and threatening. He began yelling and waving his arms, making as much noise as possible. Get out of here. Go on. Get. For several terrifying minutes, they could hear the bear moving around in the darkness, just outside the ring of firelight. Emma could sense its massive presence, could almost feel its eyes watching them. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the bear left. They heard its heavy footsteps receding into the forest, followed by silence. Jake didn't lower his rifle for another 10 minutes. When he finally did, his hands were shaking slightly. Is it gone? Tommy asked in a small voice. I think so, Jake said. But we're keeping this fire burning bright all night. And we're taking watches. Watches? Emma asked. One person stays awake while the others sleep. We'll take turns. I'll take the first watch, you take the second, Emma. Emma felt a surge of pride that Jake trusted her with such an important responsibility. What do I watch for? Movement in the shadows. Sounds that don't belong. If you see or hear anything unusual, you wake me immediately. That night, Emma learned what it meant to be truly alone with her fear. During her watch, every sound in the forest seemed magnified and threatening. An owl's call made her jump. The crack of a settling log in the fire sounded like footsteps. But she didn't wake Jake unless she was truly alarmed. She understood that his rest was precious, and that panicking over every small sound would help nobody. When her watch was over and she woke Jake for his turn, he looked at her with something like respect. See anything? He asked quietly. Nothing dangerous, Emma reported. Just forest sounds. Jake nodded. You did good. Not many people can handle their first night watch without getting spooked. As Emma settled down to sleep, she realized that something had changed in their little group. Jake wasn't just taking care of them anymore. He was beginning to trust them to help take care of themselves and each other. The next day brought their biggest challenge yet. They came to a river that was running fast and deep, swollen with snowmelt and recent storms. The water looked black and cold, and Emma couldn't see the bottom. How deep is it? She asked. Jake threw a stick into the water and watched it disappear immediately. Deep enough to drown in, and cold enough to kill you even if you don't drown. He studied the riverbank in both directions, looking for alternatives. There might be a ford upstream, or maybe a fallen tree we could use as a bridge. They spent the rest of that day searching for a safe way across. They found the remains of an old bridge, but most of it had been washed away in some previous flood. They found places where the water ran shallower, but even those spots were too deep and dangerous for Tommy. As evening approached, Jake made a decision that would change everything. We're going to build a raft, he announced. It's the only way to get across safely. Emma looked at the fast-moving water with its dangerous currents and felt her stomach drop. Is that safe? Nothing about this trip is safe, Jake replied. But it's the best option we have. They spent the evening gathering fallen logs and dead branches suitable for raft building. Jake showed them how to test wood to make sure it was sound and would float properly. We'll need rope to lash it together, Jake said, examining their supplies. I've got some, but not much. Emma had an idea. What about our extra clothes? Could we tear them into strips and braid them together? Jake looked at her with approval. That's smart thinking. We'll need every piece of rope we can make. They worked until well after dark, building their makeshift raft by firelight. It wasn't pretty, but it looked like it would float and carry their weight. As they prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring their most dangerous day yet, Emma found herself thinking about how much had changed since Jake found them in the snow. They were no longer just three strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming a team, each contributing what they could to their shared survival. And, despite all the dangers they faced, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents died. She felt like she belonged somewhere again. Dawn came gray and bitter cold. Emma woke to the sound of Jake moving around the camp, packing his few belongings with practiced efficiency. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, but she could still feel warmth radiating from them. Time to move, Jake said quietly when he saw her stirring. Storm's coming, and we need to find better shelter before it hits. Emma shook Tommy gently awake. Her little brother's face was flushed with warmth from sleeping close to the fire, but she could see the exhaustion still etched around his eyes. The past few days had aged him in ways that shouldn't happen to a 5-year-old. I'm hungry, Tommy said as soon as he opened his eyes. Jake handed them each a piece of hardtack and some jerky. This is breakfast, he said. We'll eat better when we stop for the night, if we can find game. Emma bit into the hardtack, which was so hard it hurt her teeth. But she was grateful for anything to eat. She watched Jake as he worked, noticing how he wasted no motion, how everything he owned had its specific place in his pack. How far is the settlement? She asked. 3 weeks if the weather holds, Jake replied, cinching his saddle. Maybe longer if we run into storms. And we will run into storms. He helped Tommy climb onto his horse, a sturdy brown mare with patient eyes. Her name's Belle, he told Tommy. She's carried me through a lot of rough country. Emma walked alongside the horse as they started moving. Jake led Belle by the reins, setting a steady pace that ate up ground without exhausting anyone. The snow crunched under their feet, and their breath steamed in the cold air. As they walked, Jake began teaching them things they would need to know. See those clouds, he said, pointing to the northern horizon. Dark and moving fast. That means heavy snow, probably tonight. We need to find somewhere to hole up. Emma studied the sky, trying to memorize the signs. Her papa had known weather, but she had never paid close enough attention to his warnings. What about food? She asked. What happens when the jerky runs out? Then, we hunt, Jake said simply. Or we go hungry. Out here, you eat what you can find when you can find it. They walked for hours through increasingly rough terrain. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills covered in scrub brush and scattered stands of trees. Sometimes Jake would stop and study the ground, looking for signs that Emma couldn't read. Animal tracks, he explained when she asked. Rabbit, deer, maybe elk. We'll set snares tonight if we have time. Around midday, they stopped beside a small creek that ran clear and cold between ice-covered banks. Jake let Belle drink while he filled their water containers. Is the water safe? Emma asked, remembering her mother's warnings about drinking from streams. This high up, it's clean, Jake said. But always look upstream first. Make sure nothing dead is floating in it. Emma knelt by the creek and drank deeply. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it tasted pure and good. Tommy splashed some on his face and giggled at the shock of it. They ate a quick meal of jerky and hardtack, then started moving again. The wind was picking up, and Emma could feel the temperature dropping. Dark clouds were building in the north, and she could smell snow in the air. How much farther today? She asked. Jake squinted at the sky. Maybe 2 more hours. There's a place ahead where some rocks form a kind of shelter. We can build a fire there and ride out whatever's coming. As they walked, Emma found herself studying Jake more carefully. He moved like someone who had spent his entire life outdoors, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her. His clothes were worn, but well-maintained, and his boots showed the kind of wear that came from thousands of miles of walking. "Were you a cowboy?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment. "Among other things," he said finally. "I've done a lot of different work over the years." There was something in his voice that discouraged more questions, so Emma fell silent. She sensed there were things in Jake's past that he didn't want to talk about, and she was smart enough not to push. The first snowflakes began falling when they were still an hour from the shelter Jake had mentioned. Within minutes, the flakes grew larger and more frequent. Soon, they were walking through a steady snowfall that limited visibility to just a few hundred yards. "Stay close," Jake warned. "In weather like this, you can get lost 20 feet from camp." Emma took Tommy's hand and made sure they stayed right behind Jake and Belle. The horse seemed to know where they were going, picking her way carefully through the increasingly rough terrain. Just when Emma thought they might be walking into the storm with no shelter in sight, Jake stopped and pointed ahead. Through the swirling snow, she could see dark shapes that resolved into a cluster of large boulders arranged in a rough semicircle. "There," Jake said with satisfaction. "Home for the night." The rocks formed a natural windbreak, and someone had clearly used this spot before. There were the remains of old campfires, and even a few pieces of wood stacked against one of the boulders. Jake quickly set up camp while Emma and Tommy gathered what dry wood they could find. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was starting to howl through the rocks. "Good thing we found this place," Jake said as he got the fire started. "This storm's going to be a bad one." Soon they had a good fire burning, and Jake set up his small pot to melt snow for water. He also began preparing what would become their evening meal. More rabbit from yesterday, supplemented with some dried beans that he soaked in the hot water. "Tell me about your parents," Jake said as they waited for the food to cook. "What kind of people were they?" Emma felt a pang of sadness, but she was grateful that someone wanted to hear about Mama and Papa. "Papa was a farmer back in Missouri," she said. "He worked hard, but the land wasn't good, and the weather kept ruining his crops. He said Oregon would be different." "What about your mother?" "Mama could make anything grow," Emma said, smiling at the memory. "She had a garden behind our house that was like something from a story. She knew which plants would help when you were sick, and she could cook anything and make it taste good." Tommy, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Mama used to sing to me when I was scared." Jake nodded. "Sounds like they were good people." "They were," Emma said firmly. "They didn't deserve to die from fever in the middle of nowhere." "Nobody deserves that," Jake agreed. "But sometimes life doesn't care what people deserve." The storm intensified as night fell. Wind howled around their shelter, and snow piled up fast outside the ring of rocks. But inside their small protected space, the fire kept them warm, and the hot food filled their bellies. "What about you?" Emma asked Jake as they prepared for sleep. "Do you have family somewhere?" Jake was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "Had a family once," he said finally. "Lost them in the war." Emma wanted to ask more questions, but something in Jake's expression warned her off. Instead, she helped Tommy get settled under the blankets Jake had shared with them. As the storm raged outside, Emma lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about their situation. They were completely dependent on a man they had known for less than 24 hours. She didn't even know if he was telling the truth about there being a settlement 3 weeks away. But what choice did they have? And, despite her caution, something about Jake Morrison felt solid and dependable. He had shared his food and his fire and his blankets without asking for anything in return. He had taken on the responsibility of 2 children when it would have been easier to walk away. Emma drifted off to sleep with the sound of the storm outside and the steady breathing of Jake and Tommy nearby. For the second night in a row, she wasn't facing the darkness alone. When she woke the next morning, the storm had passed, but the world outside their shelter was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Everything was pristine white, beautiful, and deadly. Jake was already up, studying the landscape with concern. "How bad is it?" Emma asked. "Bad enough," Jake said grimly. "This much snow will slow us down, and there's more weather coming behind it." He looked at her seriously. "Emma, I need you to understand something. What we're trying to do, getting 3 people and 1 horse through this country in winter, it's not something most folks would even attempt." Emma felt fear creep into her chest, but she pushed it down. "Are you saying we should turn back?" Turn back to what? Jake asked. There's nothing behind us but your parents' graves and empty wilderness. We go forward, or we die here. He began packing their few belongings. But I need to know that you and Tommy can handle whatever comes next, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. Emma looked at her little brother, still sleeping peacefully under the warm blankets. Then, she looked at Jake, this stranger who had become their protector and guide. We can handle it, she said quietly. We don't have any other choice. Jake nodded grimly. That's exactly right, he said. We don't have any other choice. As they prepared to leave their shelter and head back into the unforgiving wilderness, Emma realized that their real test was just beginning. The easy part, finding food and shelter for one night, was over. Now they had to prove they could survive week after week of winter travel through some of the most dangerous country in America. But for the first time since her parents died, Emma felt like they had a real chance. Jake Morrison might be a mystery, but he was also their lifeline, and she was determined not to let him regret his decision to help them. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that clung to everything like a death shroud. 8-year-old Emma Hartwell pulled her little brother closer as they stumbled through the drifts, their breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. Tommy was only 5, and his legs could barely carry him through snow that sometimes reached his chest. His lips had turned blue hours ago, and Emma knew they were in terrible trouble. I'm cold, Emma, Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. When are Mama and Papa coming back? Emma felt her heart break all over again. She had watched their parents die 3 days ago, first Papa with the fever burning him up from the inside, then Mama just hours later. The other families in their wagon train had already moved on, afraid the sickness would spread to their own children. They left behind only promises to send help when they reached the next settlement. Help that never came. They're not coming back, Tommy, Emma said softly, kneeling in the snow to look into her brother's confused eyes. But we have to keep walking. We have to find people who can help us. The truth was, Emma didn't know where they were going. She had grabbed what little food remained in their wagon and started walking in the direction the other wagons had gone. That was 2 days ago, and now their small bundle of supplies was almost empty. They had shared the last piece of hard bread that morning. The landscape around them stretched endlessly in all directions, covered in white. Dead grass poked through the snow in some places, and bare trees stood like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Emma had never felt so alone in her entire life. Look, Tommy said suddenly, pointing ahead. There's smoke. Emma squinted through the falling snow and saw it too, a thin column of gray smoke rising in the distance. Her heart jumped with hope, but she tried to stay calm. The last time they had seen smoke, it turned out to be just steam rising from a hot spring, and they had wasted precious energy walking toward it. Maybe it's a campfire, she said carefully. Let's go see. They trudged through the snow, Tommy holding tight to Emma's hand. With each step, the smoke became clearer. Soon, they could smell it too, the wonderful scent of burning wood and something cooking. Emma's stomach cramped with hunger. They hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning. As they got closer, they could see a small camp tucked between some large rocks that provided shelter from the wind. A single horse stood nearby, its reins tied to a scraggly bush. The animal looked tired but well-fed, with a thick winter coat that steamed in the cold air. A man sat beside the fire, poking at something in a small pot with a wooden spoon. He wore a worn brown coat, and a hat pulled low over his face. Emma couldn't tell how old he was, but something about the way he sat suggested he was bone-tired, the kind of tired that comes from riding hard for many days. Emma stopped about 20 feet away from the camp, suddenly uncertain. On the trail, strangers could be dangerous. Her papa had always told her to be careful around men she didn't know. But they were so hungry, and so cold, and the fire looked so warm. The man must have heard them, because he looked up suddenly. Emma saw a weathered face with several days' worth of stubble and eyes the color of winter sky. He stared at them for a long moment, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. Then, louder, you kids lost. Emma found her voice. Our parents died, she said simply. We've been walking for 3 days. The man set down his spoon and studied them more carefully. Emma knew they must look terrible, dirty, exhausted, with clothes that were far too thin for the weather. Tommy's shoes had holes in them, and his feet were probably close to frostbite. 3 days, the man repeated. In this weather? He shook his head. You shouldn't be alive. He stood up slowly, and Emma saw that he was tall and lean, the kind of build that came from years of hard work. There was something about his movements that reminded her of her papa, careful and deliberate, like someone who had learned to be ready for trouble. I'm Jake Morrison, he said, and you two look like you could use some food and warmth. Emma hesitated. Everything her parents had taught her said not to trust strangers. But Tommy was shivering so hard he could barely stand, and the smell of whatever was cooking in that pot made her mouth water. I'm Emma, she said finally. This is my little brother Tommy. Jake nodded. Well, Emma and Tommy, you're welcome to share my fire. I've got some rabbit stew cooking, and it's more than enough for one person. He gestured toward the rocks near the fire. Come on over and get warm. We can figure out what to do next once you've got some hot food in you. Emma led Tommy toward the fire, still wary but desperate for warmth. As they sat down on the rocks, she felt the heat from the flames start to thaw her frozen face. Tommy immediately held his hands out toward the fire, making small sounds of relief. Jake ladled stew into 2 tin cups and handed them over. Careful, it's hot, he warned. But it'll warm you up from the inside. Emma took a small sip and nearly cried. The stew was simple but delicious. Chunks of rabbit meat in a rich broth with wild onions and some kind of root vegetable. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Tommy was less careful, taking big gulps despite the heat. Jake watched them eat with an unreadable expression. So, he said after they had eaten about half the stew, where exactly are your folks buried? Emma pointed back in the direction they had come. 3 days that way, maybe more. We were with the Henderson wagon train, but they kept moving after Mama and Papa died. Jake's expression darkened. They left you alone? With your parents just buried? They were scared the fever would spread, Emma explained. Mrs. Henderson said they would send help when they got to the next town. And how long ago was that? Emma thought. 5 days, maybe 6. We waited for help to come, but nobody came, so we started walking. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Emma could see anger in his eyes, but she didn't think it was directed at her and Tommy. That was wrong, he said finally. Leaving children alone like that. Whatever their reasons, it was wrong. He refilled their cups with more stew. Tell me about your family. Where were you headed? Papa had land waiting for him in Oregon, Emma said. He had papers and everything. We were going to build a farm and grow wheat. Her voice caught a little. Papa said the soil there was so good you could grow anything. Jake nodded slowly. Oregon's a long way from here, especially with winter coming on hard. He looked at them seriously. You understand that your folks are gone, don't you? And that wagon train is probably a week ahead of us by now. Emma felt tears threatening, but held them back. She had to be strong for Tommy. I know, she said quietly. The question is, what do we do now? Jake continued. It's getting colder every day, and we're at least 3 weeks from the nearest settlement. Maybe more, if the weather turns bad. Emma's heart sank. She had hoped this kind stranger might know of a town nearby, or maybe a family that could take them in. But 3 weeks through this wilderness seemed impossible. Are you going to the settlement? She asked. Jake was quiet for a moment. I wasn't planning on it, he said honestly. I've been heading south, trying to get ahead of the worst of the winter weather. Emma felt Tommy lean against her shoulder. He was warm now and full of food, and the exhaustion was catching up with him. His eyes were already closing. If you leave us here, we'll die, Emma said quietly. She wasn't trying to make Jake feel guilty. She was just stating a fact. 2 children alone in the wilderness with winter closing and had no chance of survival. Jake looked at her for a long moment. I know that, he said. The question is, can the 3 of us make it together? I've got 1 horse, limited supplies, and a long way to go. Emma met his eyes steadily. Tommy's little, but he's strong. And I can work. I can cook and mend clothes and gather firewood. We won't be just extra mouths to feed. Something in Jake's expression softened slightly. You're mighty grown up for 8 years old. I have to be, Emma said simply. Jake stood up and walked to the edge of his camp, looking out at the darkening sky. Snow was still falling, and the wind was picking up. Emma could see him thinking, weighing their chances. When he came back to the fire, his decision was made. "We'll try it," he said. "But I won't lie to you. It's going to be harder than anything you've ever done. We'll be traveling in weather that can kill, through country where one mistake means we all die. And I can't promise we'll make it." Emma felt a surge of relief, so strong it made her dizzy. "We understand," she said. "And thank you." Jake nodded grimly. "Don't thank me yet. Ask me again if we're still alive in 3 weeks. He pulled a thick blanket from his pack and handed it to her. "Wrap your brother up and get some sleep. We'll start moving at first light, and we need to cover as much ground as possible before the next storm hits." As Emma wrapped the blanket around Tommy, she felt the first real hope she had experienced since her parents died. This stranger, this cowboy who had no reason to risk his life for 2 orphan children, had just given them a chance to live. She didn't know if they would make it to safety. She didn't even know if Jake Morrison was a good man or if they could trust him completely. But for the first time in days, she wasn't facing the wilderness alone. The fire crackled softly as snow continued to fall around their small camp. In the distance, a wolf howled, long and lonely. Emma pulled Tommy closer and closed her eyes, listening to the steady breathing of the man who had just become their only hope for survival. Tomorrow, their real journey would begin in the unforgiving wilderness of 1870s Montana, where winter winds could freeze a man solid in minutes, and wolves hunted in desperate packs. 2 small children wandered alone through snow that reached their waists. Their parents lay buried beneath stones 3 days behind them, victims of the fever that swept through wagon trains like wildfire. What happened next defied every rule of survival on the frontier. A drifting cowboy, running from his own demons and carrying nothing but coffee grounds and hardtack, made a choice that seemed like madness to any reasonable person. He took on 2 starving children when he could barely keep himself alive. This is not a fairy tale. This is the raw, honest story of how desperation, unexpected kindness, and stubborn human decency created a family from the ashes of tragedy. It's about a man who discovered that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself, and about 2 children who learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people willing to share their last crust of bread when the world has turned its back on you. The trail ahead was brutal. Winter was closing in fast, and nobody expected any of them to survive what was coming.